Hello, my friend. Today we take a step back from the noise, the headlines, the political theater, and the endless propaganda to confront the reality of the war in Ukraine as it stands on December 1st, 2025. For nearly 4 years, you've been told that Kyiv is winning, that Russia is isolated, that NATO is united, and that peace will come only through Ukrainian victory. Made. But what if everything you've been told has been upside down? Despite all the speeches and slogans, decisions about Ukraine's fate are now being made, not in Brussels, not in Kyiv, but in quiet rooms between Washington and Moscow. Europe has lost its leverage. The West is divided, and time is running out for Ukraine. So today, let's strip away the illusions and look directly at the truth the media refuses to acknowledge. Russia holds the decisive position, and the world is rapidly adjusting to that fact. Let's dive in. We are approaching 4 full years of a war in Ukraine that never needed to happen and could have been stopped multiple times along the way. Yet here we are at another decisive moment, and once again, it is Russia and the United States that are shaping the actual outcome, while Europe clings to illusions. What is happening right now around the so-called peace process is not a mystery. There is an American proposal on the table, a 28-point plan worked out in close consultation with Russia. Formally, it is a U.S. plan. In substance, it is a heavily watered-down version of Russia's minimal conditions, not some fantasy of Russian capitulation as Western media likes to claim. This proposal could have never taken the form it has without substantial Russian consent. Moscow has already said very clearly that it considers this document a S. This plan is not something that fell out of the sky yesterday. The consultations between Washington and Moscow go back a long way, well before the Alaska summit. By that time, they already had the broad contours of a deal to end the war. What killed it back then was Washington's unwillingness to accept one of Russia's core demands, that Ukrainian troops withdraw from the parts of Donbass they still occupied. That was the red line, the A. Now that obstacle's been removed not because Russia gave up, but because the battlefield realities have made it impossible to ignore Moscow's position. One of the fundamental points of the current American plan is precisely this: Ukrainian withdrawal from those remaining parts of Donbass and the transfer of those territories to Russian jurisdiction. That principle is baked into the document. The United States has finally had to acknowledge what Russia was saying from the B. The Europeans, of course, have tried to sabotage this from the start. They have been busy behind the scenes pushing amendments that would effectively nullify the entire territorial and security core of the plan. In other words, they tried to turn a serious peace proposal into an impossible one, and they failed. Washington listened politely and then sidelined them. Brussels can spin it however it likes, but their input has had no decisive impact. The process is being shaped in a Russian-American format, not a Euro-Atlantic one. Europe has been reduced to a spectator. The media in the West desperately sells this narrative that Trump is capitulating to Russia's maximalist demands. That is nonsense. The truth is almost the opposite. The plan now circulating is a boiled-down minimalist version of Russia's requirements, and within that, the Americans have squeezed out a surprising number of concessions favorable to Ukraine. From Kyiv's standpoint, this is as good a deal as they are ever going to see. It will not get better. Every extra month of war will only make any future settlement harsher. That is why the real drama at this moment is not between Washington and Moscow. That deal is essentially there. The real question is what Ukraine does when confronted with the reality of it. Do they accept the deal and face an enormous internal crisis? Political, social, maybe even constitutional? Or do they reject it, fight on for a few more months, and then end up forced to accept something far worse under much weaker conditions? This is not a simple, rational calculation for Kyiv. On paper, the rational thing is obvious. They are losing the war badly. They are staring at the prospect of significant military defeat and a dramatically worse bargaining position in the near future. Rationally, they should take the deal now. But politics is not only rational, it is emotional, psychological, and in Ukraine's case, deeply tied to internal power struggles and nationalist rhetoric that has been fueled for years. Think about the territorial part of the plan. As it stands, Ukrainian forces withdraw from the remaining areas of Donbass they still hold. Those territories transfer to Russian sovereignty, but under the proposal, they become part of a demilitarized zone. Russia gains jurisdiction, but does not station its troops there. In parallel, Russia is supposed to withdraw forces from areas of Ukraine outside the 4 regions it has claimed, including parts of Zaporizhia and other contested zones. That is the quid pro quo on offer today. Now imagine Kyiv says no and keeps fighting. What happens? Sooner rather than later, Russian forces will advance militarily into those same areas. They will not become a demilitarized zone. They will become Russian-occupied territory. And after fighting and bleeding for them, Moscow is not going to turn around and say, all right, let's now demilitarize what we just took by force. The concession currently on the table, Russian withdrawal from certain areas and demilitarization of others, evaporates the moment Ukraine rejects the deal and chooses to continue the war. So Ukraine faces a brutal choice. Accept the plan and trigger a massive domestic crisis with accusations of betrayal, uprisings of volunteers, broken parties, maybe the end of the current regime. Or reject the plan, keep fighting, lose even more territory and more people, and then accept a worse deal under conditions of exhaustion and collapse. It's a choice between a shock now or an even bigger catastrophe later. Time is not on Ukraine's side. Every month that passes, they lose more men, more infrastructure, more people immigrating, more of their demographic base evaporating. A country that once had around 57 million people is now believed to be reduced to something in the mid-20 seconds or low 30 seconds. This is a national amputation on a scale Europe pretends not to see. And yet European leaders continue as if they are the main protagonists in this story. They are not. In the current phase of negotiations, they have been deliberately sidelined. They were not invited to Florida. They are not in Moscow for the crucial meetings. They are not shaping the Russian-American framework. They are being held at arm's length because they don't want peace. They want the war to continue. Why? Because Europe has invested a colossal amount of political capital into this war. They told their own populations that Russia was on the verge of collapse, that NATO would defeat Moscow in Ukraine, that Putin was finished. If this ends with a settlement broadly shaped by Russian terms neutrality, no NATO membership, territorial changes, demilitarization, that is not just a defeat for Kyiv. It is a humiliation for the political elites in Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and beyond. Their entire narrative implodes. So they cling to wishful thinking. They convince themselves that Russia is weaker than it looks, that prolonging the war will somehow produce a better negotiating position later, that if Ukraine just keeps bleeding long enough, something miraculous will happen in Moscow. They become prisoners of their own propaganda. Today, Kyiv, tomorrow, the Baltic states, Russia will attack NATO next, and so on. These fantasies are divorced from military reality, but they have taken on a life of their own in European capitals. Let's look at another critical aspect of the plan, the size and structure of the future Ukrainian army. We've all seen this figure of 600,000 troops floated in public discussions. Some Europeans even talk about an 800,000 strong Ukrainian force as a security guarantee. The immediate, obvious question is, who pays for that? Ukraine today is economically shattered. It cannot finance such an army. The only way those forces exist is if Europe pays for them year after year. That is precisely the kind of dependency on NATO and the EU that Russia rejects. Moscow wants Ukraine to be neutral, genuinely neutral, not a NATO proxy in disguise. That means no long-term military dependence on Western money and structures. At the same time, Russia understands that a neutral Ukraine will still want a reasonable-sized army to defend its borders, not just from Russia, but from other neighbors with whom it has long-standing disputes: Poland, Romania, Hungary, and so on. A neutral state has legitimate security needs. So the question is not army or no army, but the size and orientation of that army. The 600,000 figure looks suspiciously like something the Americans might have tossed in as a way of appeasing Kyiv and some European hawks, rather than a number Russia itself proposed. A more realistic figure might be 200,000 to 400,000 troops. And even at 400,000, Ukraine would still possess the largest army in Europe, bigger than Germany's, bigger than Britain's. From Russia's perspective, the key is not the headcount in absolute terms, but what alliances and funding structures stand behind that army. If it's financed and guided by NATO and the EU, that is unacceptable. If it is a neutral, Ukraine's own force under a neutral security architecture, that is something Russia can live with. Europe, however, has its own agenda. Beyond Ukraine's battlefield fate, the war has become an excuse for the militarization of the European Union itself. Talk of European strategic autonomy, of rearmament, of massive purchases of weapons, largely from the United States, has become constant. In practice, Europe is pouring money into the American military-industrial complex while pretending to be defending freedom in Ukraine. Kyiv is the battlefield, but Europe is the customer, and Washington is the supplier. This is where another crucial piece of the puzzle comes in: Russia's frozen central bank assets. The majority of those are in Europe, especially Belgium. The American plan assumes that these assets will be unfrozen and returned to Russia, with Moscow agreeing to allocate a portion of them to the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. That is an enormous lever. Europe is sitting on the funds. Russia wants them back. The United States wants to use them to structure a grand bargain. And all of this will require a renegotiation of the European security order itself, Russia's relationship to NATO, Ukraine's neutrality, and Europe's role in the new architecture. So, no, Europe is not irrelevant in the long run. On the contrary, it is crucial to any stable, durable peace. But in this phase of the process, the hard, ugly phase, where you decide war or ceasefire, Europe is an obstacle, not a partner. That is why the Americans have chosen to move forward with Russia and Ukraine, leaving Brussels to one side until there is a concrete deal to put in front of them. Look at the envoys Trump has chosen for the critical talks in Moscow: Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Whatever one thinks of them personally, they clearly have a better grasp of the Russian perspective and more willingness to engage with it than the typical neocon political class in Washington. Rubio, the archetypal hawk, is conspicuously absent from the delegation. Whether this is a deliberate signal or simply division of labor, the message is clear enough. The White House is serious about reaching a deal with Moscow, and it prefers to send people who can actually talk to Russia rather than shout at it. Is Rubio irrelevant? No. There is still a powerful pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia lobby in Washington. Domestic politics in the U.S. remain complicated, but the fact that peace talks are being conducted through figures more sympathetic to Russian concerns suggests that, at least for now, Trump is willing to push back against the permanent war faction and try to end this conflict on terms that Moscow can accept. Meanwhile, Ukraine's internal situation is becoming more and more unstable. The former commander of the Ukrainian army, now ambassador to the United Kingdom, Zaluzhny, or Zilly, depending on transliteration, has openly called for nuclear weapons in Ukraine as part of its alleged security guarantees. He is clearly positioning himself as a future presidential contender. This is not a serious security proposal. It is political theater. But it tells us something important. Key figures in Kyiv already sense the end of Zelensky's regime approaching and are maneuvering for the next phase. We have seen similar fantasies before. Western academics like John Mearsheimer once argued that Ukraine should have kept Soviet nuclear weapons, ignoring the hard reality that Kyiv never actually controlled those assets and lacked the technical capability to use them. But these old talking points are now being recycled as if they were credible options. It is delusional. Russia has made it absolutely clear that nuclearization of Ukraine is a red line that goes beyond any question of negotiation. Pushing such ideas at this stage is a sign of desperation, not strategy. This desperation is not limited to Ukraine. In Europe, there is a deep unwillingness to confront the truth. Russia has been consistent throughout. Read what Moscow said in 2021. Read what it said in early 2022. Then look at what it is saying now. The core demands have not changed. Ukrainian neutrality, recognition of new territorial realities, demilitarization of the threat on Russia's border. Compare that with the West. Positions shift every 6 months. Red lines appear and vanish. Slogans replace strategy. The only constant is the refusal to acknowledge that Russia is winning the war and will not be defeated. The war could have been avoided altogether if Russia's security proposals had been taken seriously before February 2022. It could have been stopped in the early negotiations when Kiev and Moscow were talking about neutrality and security guarantees. It could have ended around 2024, when Putin publicly proposed terms that are essentially similar to what is now on the table: neutrality, territorial adjustments, demilitarization, and a new security framework. Every time, it was the combination of European and, at that earlier stage, American policy that urged Ukraine to fight on instead of compromise. Now the roles have shifted. Trump does not want an endless war in Ukraine. Washington is finally feeling the cost of this conflict. Economic, political, strategic. European elites, however, have discovered that this war serves their short-term political needs. It justifies rearmament, internal crackdowns, and a relentless propaganda line against Russia. They claim to defend Ukraine while pushing Kyiv toward total ruin. So where does this leave us? We stand on the edge of a possible Russian-American deal. The 28-point plan, or something very similar, is likely to be the framework. It offers Ukraine the least bad outcome available under the circumstances: a neutral state with a sizable army of its own, territorially reduced but still viable, with reconstruction funds in sight and the prospect of a stable security architecture. It offers Russia the essentials it has demanded from the beginning: no NATO in Ukraine, recognition of its sovereignty over key territories, and an end to a war that, while going in its favor, still imposes real costs. If Ukraine accepts, we will probably see a ceasefire quickly, perhaps within weeks or months, once its forces withdraw from the remaining parts of Donbass in accordance with Russia's conditions. Moscow has already stated that it will guarantee the safety of that withdrawal and halt offensive operations once that step is taken. The guns could fall silent sooner than many think, but a ceasefire is not the same as a durable peace. Inside Ukraine, accepting such a deal would unleash a storm. Accusations of treason, power struggles, maybe violent clashes between factions. A new leadership might emerge that tries to reverse the process, sabotage implementation, or prepare for a new round of conflict in a few years. The crisis could continue in a frozen form with periodic flare-ups for a long time. If Ukraine rejects the deal, the war continues. Russia advances, consolidates more territory, and the eventual outcome becomes harsher. The Ukrainian state weakens further. Millions more leave. The demographic and economic base shrinks even more. Europe keeps talking about values while quietly preparing its own security order without ever admitting its share of responsibility for destroying the country it claimed to defend. So, yes, it is entirely possible that a year from now we will be talking about the same conflict but in a different phase. Perhaps by then there will be a ceasefire, and we will be discussing the fragile peace, the risk of renewed war, and the internal crises reshaping Ukraine and Europe. Or perhaps the chance will have been missed yet again, and the war will still be burning, only with even less left of Ukraine to save. Russia knows exactly what it wants and has been clear from the beginning. The West, and especially Europe, still has not decided whether it wants peace on realistic terms or permanent confrontation built on illusions. That is the real divide today, not between democracy and autocracy, not between good and evil, but between those who live in reality and those who would rather sacrifice an entire country than admit they were wrong.